Hello, welcome to the WNPS webinar, Alpine Flowers of Mt.Rainier. Welcome. I see Amy Myers, I see Connie McCauley, I see Doxy Kemp, I see Jane Tessner, George Stout. Welcome, Marcia Stone, Jane Healy, David Berger, Chuck Lennox, welcome. Welcome, Fritz Ulrich. Welcome, Michael Kirkpatrick. Sorry.
There's my buddy Dave Wines. Hi, Dave.
And Rick Mattson. Sarah Fulton. Sharon Rodman. Welcome. Bill Burkerson.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Richard Scranton. Welcome. Peggy Butler. Shelley Evans. Susan Kephart. Welcome. Sarah Gage. You are all muted. However, please feel free to chat and say hello. All attendees can see the chat. Teresa Skaggs, Tina Miller. We're here today with Gail Sklar and Donovan Tracy for the Alpine Flowers of Mt.Rainier. Linda Cochran, welcome. June Koloff. Josh Morris, welcome. Dan Bird, welcome. This is going to get everybody excited to be outside for that someday soon, I hope. Catherine Askren, Krista Russell, welcome. Ernie Thompson, Franya Bryant, Janet Wall, everybody's coming on in. We're expecting over 200 folks today, so we're going to give it just a few minutes to give people time to get comfortable and signed in. Lindsay Human, welcome. Miri Sethi, Pam Borso, Paul Brayer, welcome. Yay. You have about 1 minute to get that last drink of water and be comfortable, or perhaps you're having your lunch. Marcia Smith, I see you. That means Rod's there too, I hope. Welcome. Cleveland Hall, welcome. We'll wait just a few more seconds. All of the participants are in mute mode. You do have a Q&A, and you also have a raised hand. And I see that Jasna Guy has a raised hand, and we can actually unmute you. Hello, Jasna Guy. Do you have something to say?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm new to this, and I'm having difficulty actually coming up on your screen. Can you see me?
No.
No, I didn't think so. Okay.
All of our attendees are off camera at the moment and also
Okay.
muted. I
Okay.
am going to mute you again, but I would like to announce to the group that for our Q&A session today, we are going to welcome folks with a camera and a microphone into our meeting. So if after Donovan's presentation you would like to come into the meeting, please raise your hand.
Okay.
And I will go through the list and I will unmute and I will you can turn your camera on and become a panelist and be a part of our group online as a nice way for all of us to connect.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm going to mute you now, Jasna. Thank you for
Thank
raising
you.
your hand. All right, I would like to turn over the microphone to our Native Plant Appreciation Month Committee Chair, Gail Sklar. Gail is WNPS State Board of Directors at Large and a member of the South Sound chapter. Gail, welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Donovan, who is an amateur photographer with a special interest in wildflowers. He is a volunteer with the UW Herbarium and co-author of the Wildflower Guide, Alpine Flowers of Mt.Rainier with David Giblin, the Herbarium's collection manager. He developed the website Flowers of Rhaenyra, which features 230 species and 12 wildflower hikes. He enjoys sharing his interest and passion in wildlife photography and given numerous presentations to WNPS chapters. Recently, he presented his photographic study of the life cycle of an enemy accidentalist, entitled The Mopheads of Mt.Rainier. Sorry to butcher that, Donovan, to the Sound South chapter, where he is an affiliated member. He is a graduate of the University of Washington and lives on Lake Forest Park. He is also a member of the Central Puget Sound chapter, and we are all in for a wonderful treat. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Gail. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you all for being with us today. It's really quite flattering to have this many people. I guess whenever you have Mt.Rainier in the title of a presentation, you're guaranteed of a pretty good turnout. So as Gail mentioned, I am the co-author of the Alpine Flowers of Mt.Rainier guide. This has been, a very good fortune for me to work with David Giblin, the collections manager of the Herbarium. Even though I'm a volunteer at the Herbarium, I'm in no way representing the Burke Museum or the Herbarium today. So this has been a great project. We're in the 3rd edition, and all the net proceeds from the sale list go to the Herbarium, and David makes good use of those through community education and outreach. And usually I put this at the end, but I'll put it up here and repeat it at the end. If you're interested in getting the guide online, currently you have to use that discoveryournorthwest.org access for it. So there's my website and my email. I'd like to thank some people. David, of course, who's got to be the most patient guy in the world. When I think about the dumb questions I've asked him over the last 10 years, I kind of cringe, but he still talks to me. I'd like to give a shout out to David Beek and Susan McDougall for the work they've done on Mt.Rainier. And I think I wouldn't be where I was if they hadn't done the flora of Mt.Rainier National Park, which has been increasingly more important. Volunteers in the park try to keep things safe and sane. In addition to these two, there's also the Western Trails Association and the Mt.Rainier National Park Associates, who help the Park Service with trail maintenance and other projects. And of course, you all, the Native Plant Society, which has been a real blessing for me to have, because it's given me a terrific outlet to share some of the work I've done. Last but not least, I'd like to thank my lovely wife, Linda, who's my designated driver, gets me there and back. And she's sitting in today with a sharp stick. So if I go too long or start to ramble, you might hear me tweak a little bit. A brief introduction on the park. It represents about 5% of the total land area of the state of Washington, but yet has about 27% of the species of the state flora, 2 of which are endemic to the park, which I'll show you. 246 miles of hiking trails, probably another 50 miles of trails that receive some maintenance. The 2 major visitor center, which we'll spend our time working out of, are Paradise on the south side, elevation 5,400 feet, Sunrise on the north side at 6,400 feet. Paradise snowfall, of course, is notorious. In fact, for the longest time, it had the world record back there in 71, 72 with 1,122 inches. The low was just a few years ago, but then followed by 2 strong years. And last year it was down a little bit. The average is 640 inches in the time frame of the record. There are some gaps in there during World War II and other periods. This is kind of what it looked like the first of the month. A lot of snow. It's interesting to see it this way. Usually they keep the parking lot pretty well plowed to stay ahead of it. And here's what it looked like this morning. So that's a lot of snow. So this is going to be an interesting year. What we're going to do today is go above the timberline and look at the subalpine and alpine zones of Mt.Rainier National Park. And so how do we define those? If you were to trace a route from the Nisqually entrance up to the summit at Point Success, going through a pyramid peak, you get a profile similar to this, slightly exaggerated on the vertical scale. And within that, you can designate zones by the tree distribution. The forest zone, you'll see western hemlock and Douglas fir. They give way to mountain hemlock and subalpine fir once you get to the subalpine zone. And then, of course, the alpine zone. The alpine zone represents about 19% of the area of the park, subalpine 23, and the forest zone. You know, the forest zone we shouldn't overlook at all as native plant enthusiasts. My website has 230 species on it, and 108 of those are in the forest zone. So there's lots and lots of opportunity. The subalpine zone begins approximately between 4,800 and 5,300 feet, or the timberline, and then goes to about 65 to 7,000 for the tree line. Now, I know some of you are probably saying, well, you got that all wrong. You know, the timberline is really where you've got the tree line. That's true. Some people do use timberline to mean really the end of the continuous forest or the presence of any trees. We're using timberline and tree line here, and that's the distinction made in Polger and McKenna's Alpine Flowers of the Pacific of the Northwest. On page 48, they have a very good discussion of, they call it drawing the line, and they use this terminology. The reason for the difference is because of the snowfall on the south side. The subalpine zone and the alpine zone start at lower elevations than they do on the sunrise side, which receives about roughly half. There's no official measuring there, but roughly half the snowfall of Paradise. We do, of course, have trees in the alpine zone. And here are whitebark pine in the Krumholtz form at about 7,000 feet on the south side of Burrows Mountain. What we've done in the latest guide is, this third edition, is we've actually added a feature where we have actually put the habitat designations in a colored box. So green box is subalpine zone, blue is alpine zone. This is a little risky because, of course, you will see some subalpine flowers in the alpine zone. But we're trying to point people in kind of a direction here. So we're kind of saying you will see these species designated primarily in these zones. So between 5,000 and 6,500, and then above 6,500 for the alpine zone. So the guide has approximately 81 species in the subalpine zone and 40 in the alpine zone. Let's imagine we're not looking at our computer screens right now, and yet we're arriving at paradise for lunch after a nice leisurely trip on this 1935 white open top bus. So can you find yourself in this group? I think I'm probably about right there. That would be good, sitting in the back. Today, however, if you arrive at the new visitor center, you'll see the Muir steps, where John Muir's quote from his trip during 1889, where he said that Mt.Rainier represented the most extravagantly beautiful of all alpine gardens in all of his mountaintop wanderings. Of course, what he's referring to here are the subalpine meadows of Mt.Rainier. More contemporary, this fellow, Bob Gibbons, wrote this book, came out in 2011, the 50 Best Wildflower Sites in the World. Bob Gibbons is a British naturalist and worldwide expedition leader. And his conclusion is possibly the most flowery place in the world is Mazama Ridge in Mt.Rainier. By the way, the Olympics National Park is also included as one of those 50 sites. We're going to look at the subalpine meadows, and what we're going to use mainly is John Henderson's 1974 thesis or dissertation for his PhD at Oregon State, Composition, Distribution, and Succession of Subalpine Meadows in Mt.Rainier National Park. And he concludes in his introduction that the phytosociology and dynamics of the meadows have been neglected long enough. Phytosociology is a term that I don't think is used very often, anymore, and it's a branch of science that deals with plant communities, their composition, development, and relationship between species. But before we get to his classifications, we're going to kind of pick through Bob Gibbons' photo here, and I want to thank him. I wanted to use this photo for obvious reasons, and I couldn't get a good resolution photo. So I finally got his email and emailed and told him what I was doing and asked him if I could get a high-res photo. And he was down in Spain doing something. He said, when I get back to London, he says, I'll send you one, which he did. So we have this to look at. So let's go and look at some species here. Most of these will be familiar to you, and I will go through them rather quickly. But of course, this guy is a good place to start because he does have an official spokesman and is well known by these various names: Mophead, Mop Tops, Windflower, Old Man in the Mountain. But the Poss flower, a member of the Buttercup family, is a beautiful flower. It blooms for a short period of time and then turns into that mop head form. Anemomus is Greek for wind, and Occidentalis is Latin for western or of the west. So it's a western anemone. And it was collected in 1888 by C.V. Piper. And that specimen is beautifully preserved in the herbarium. And I show a picture of that in the mophead presentation. Magenta paintbrush is another candidate for us, and it's one of 5 paintbrush in Mt.Rainier National Park, which includes one of the anemones, the Mt.Rainier paintbrush. This was included in Bill Eggers, or Mark Eggers the other day, included this in his presentation. The harsh paintbrush is lower elevation, so we won't look at that. The scarlet, magenta, and cliff we will. Unfortunately, today we won't deal with the Mt.Rainier paintbrush. The scarlet, by the way, if anyone is interested in seeing the Mt.Rainier paintbrush, send me an email and I'll give you some tips as to how you might view it. The scarlet paintbrush photo here clearly shows the tubular flowers. It's kind of an interesting shot. They usually don't show up that well. And for some of us newbies in all of this, it's kind of interesting. Is that tubular flower really the flower? And of course, if you dissect it a little bit, you do see the parts of the pistil, the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Look inside the ovary, and sure enough, there are the seeds. So the magenta is fairly short, 6 to 12 inches. And we will be using this quite a bit. Parviflora means small flowered. Racked lousewort is one of the pedicularis. It grows up to 3 feet, often the tallest in the meadow. It contains this modified leaf at the base of the flower cluster, the spike, which is known as a bract. So we have bracts in paintbrush and lousewort. If you don't know the name of something, you call it a bract, you're probably about 50-50 chance of being correct. Here are the other pedicularis in the park. The other endemic is Mt.Rainier lousewort. These are fun plants to find and observe. Of course, the elephant heads and the bird's beak lousewort are interesting. Subalpine Lupin, member of the pea family, forms its fruit in pea pods. I've often thought that if this plant didn't exist in Mt.Rainier, the visitor levels would probably go from 2 million to 1 million. Let's look at a couple more before we get to the classifications. Here's Sitka Valyrian, very important. Grows 2 to 4 feet. Interesting leaflets on opposite sides of the flower cluster, these stem leaves. Pairs that are opposite, it almost kind of looks like Neptune's fork. And it's often confused with Gray's lovage, which is shown here. And then we'll look at Bistort. And we'll get to the classifications. If you look at the Park Service website, you'll see these 5 different types of subalpine meadows by vegetation types. And these are slightly different than what Henderson calls them. And we will start with this one, which Henderson refers to as lush herbaceous, which includes Sitka Valyrian and a number of other, species. Of course, what he did in his work is he created a key, for each of these vegetation types to then isolate the community types that, that he observed, which is fine, except for us lay people, we might glaze over a little bit at this kind of a key. So what I've tried to do is create sort of a visual key, kind of a key for dummies, so to speak. And I think that for me, I have to see things in order to feel them. And then, from there I can begin to understand them. And then that helps me further, appreciate it. So this is my attempt at creating a visual key to introduce us to the subalpine meadow classification. So on one side of the key where we have Sitka Valyrian dominant, we have 3 different community types. Let's take a look at a couple of them. Green false hellebore, which by the way, we haven't introduced yet. So this is that plant. Many of you are familiar with that. It's also known as corn lily. This plant right here is probably 6 feet high. It has a very interesting green flower with 6 anthers in yellow. So take a closer look at this the next time you see it. And this would be the meadow where you have Sitka Valyrian is present or dominant, and then the hellebore is also co-dominant. This is the one that's probably the most interesting to people because of the presence of subalpine lupin, which is very conspicuous and co-dominant with the Valyrian. So this is the Mazama Ridge Trail where we see the subalpine lupin with the bistort with the Sitka Valyrian. This meadow is probably the classical, sloping hillside Mt.Rainier with Lupin, Sitka Valyrian, and a lot of the species that we mentioned earlier. This, a few comments on photography. This was taken, obviously, in the peak of blooming at 12:01 during the day. So at full noon, full overhead sunlight, which is absolutely, the worst time. I've tried a couple times to get up there earlier to take this with better light, but one year I did, and the meadow wasn't really very good. My website has 12 wildflower hikes descriptions. This is the Mazama Ridge, or Mazama Ridge as some people call it. And the meadow I just showed you is about right there. We'll talk more about these if we have time at the end, but this gives you an idea of what I've tried to do. And I've broken up the hikes by legs or sections, and then indicated what flowers you're likely to see in that particular leg. Because obviously this one goes from 4,880 feet to 6,420 up into the Paradise Glacier, which is all glacial moraine. So you're not going to see those plants down in the first leg in the forest. A lot of wildflower guides just kind of mention the flowers you might see over the course of the whole hike. On the back side, I've given an index of the flowers shown on the front, and then a little description of each leg of the hike. We've got a bunch of chats coming in here. I wonder if I should look at them. Oh, thank you. Oh, peak flower time. I knew somebody would want to know the peak flower time. We'll talk about that later. In introducing this hike, I say quite possibly the best wildflower hike on the planet. Now, after having been to Badger Valley in the Olympics, I'm not quite sure that I would make it be that emphatic about it. Although the one thing we get, of course, with Mt.Rainier is we get the splendor of the wildflowers and the majesty of the big, majestic rock and ice of Mt.Rainier, the big guy, as I call it. Let's look at the other side of the key, where we have Sitka Valyrian is now inconspicuous or absent. We have a couple directions to go here: Subalpine Lupin, conspicuous or dominant, or it's absent. So let's look at a couple of these. First one being Bistort. So we have the Lupin Bistort community type. What we have here is no or little Sitka Valyrian. We have a lot of Lupin, and we have Bistort. So this gives us this classic meadow, which looks like a sea with white foam on it. We're going to see another one of these later on in a place that you wouldn't really expect it. Now there is a little bit of valerian, like you can see right off here on the edge, but it's inconspicuous. On the other side, we have no Lupin, and we'll look at no valerian, no Lupin. In this case, it's Lewis monkey flower. So we have a Lewis monkey flower community type. Now this is something you wouldn't really call a meadow, but it is a vast community dominated by Lewis monkey flower and the yellow mountain monkey flower, a lot of willow herb and that type of thing in this meadow as well, this community as well. This is the headwaters of Edith Creek, which is above Paradise. So on our way to Sunrise, let's make a quick stop at Chinook Pass. You can see slightly higher than Paradise. My map, hike map here shows us starting at Chinook Pass. I'd recommend this hike be done clockwise. So the first leg will be on the Pacific Crest Trail. And the first meadow photograph, we'll look at some lush herbaceous meadows here. We'll be in about this area. The second one will be when you enter the park. In this leg, you come back into the park. The second photo will be of this meadow right here. So on the first leg, since it's outside the park, there are, people can hike with their dogs, and there's a lot of activity, here. And it's I would recommend doing this during the week and during the weekend in the morning. It's about 3.5 miles long in that loop. Elevation gain's only about 770 feet. Before we look at the meadows, I want to make just kind of one sort of general sort of comment. Whenever I look at this section of the hike, I think about this. And I was hiking on my own and coming out from Dewey Lakes, and it must have been a Saturday, and I was doing it in the opposite direction. I was coming up from the south on that leg, and I came across this crimson columbine. And whenever I see these, I always stop and look and see what kind of shape it's in and whether I want to spend some time with it. And so I did. I thought this was an exceptionally, good shape, and it was nice. So I took a couple pictures, and here's the plan on the trail. And so after I took the pictures, I just figured I'm just going to hang around here for a while and watch people's reactions. So I stood back a ways, and from the time I took the first picture to the time I took this trail side view was a little over a half an hour. And in that entire half an hour, no one stopped and noticed this plant, which really kind of surprised me in a way. But then I thought, it wasn't that long ago that I was one of those guys that would have walked right by this. And that's impossible, to do now. And so it kind of calls out, what our powers of observation are, and which are our abilities to notice and pay close attention to things. And, some people are just born, I think, naturally curious. For some of us, we sort of just have to, we get kind of conditioned to looking at things. I have a grandson who is just, I think, naturally curious. You go hiking with him and he said, "What's this? What's that? What's this?" And the other ones are more concerned about, maybe whether it's good, we're going to get rained on. So here are the meadows. This is the first one on the Pacific Crest Trail side. This one is inside the park on the south side of the loop. If you haven't been on this trail, when you re-enter the park, hiking from that, you'll go a short distance and there's a kind of a large rock outcropping, which is a great place for lunch. And if you have lunch there, you may very well have found your next most favorite place. Arriving at my paradise, which is 6,400 feet at sunrise. Now, we looked at the lush herbaceous meadow at Paradise. The Park Service lists refers to this as green fescue, but Henderson calls it dry grass, dominated by bunchgrass, lupin, aster, cinquefoil. And we'll look at a couple of these. But early in the morning, as you head up from the parking lot, heading up the Sourdough Ridge, you get this view. This was taken actually in about middle of August. You'll see the bunchgrass meadow dotted with white bark pine and some alpine firs. Piper calls this the finest grass on the slopes, and it is the best known of the 33 grasses in the park. Now, my pictorial key doesn't work quite as well here, but we're going to attempt to do it anyhow. So we start looking at the key as to whether or not Subalpine Lupin or Cascade Aster is conspicuous or it's not. And if it is, it's with scarlet paintbrush, often present. And we're going to look at a couple of these. Let's look at the right side first. So Subalpine Lupin and Cascade Aster with scarlet paintbrush. We've looked at Subalpine Lupin quite a bit, so let's look at the Cascade Aster as more conspicuous than Subalpine Lupin. So this community type is Bunchgrass Aster. We should introduce the scarlet paintbrush, Miniata. It's about 50% higher roughly than the Magenta, which goes about 12 inches. This goes up to 16, characterized by these spear-shaped leaves in its bracts and leaves. And they are not divided. The Cascade Aster is very dominant in this area, the bunchgrass meadow here. Sometimes it's interesting to get up there early when you get pretty good light. This photo is kind of interesting, I think. I call these plant scapes, where you take a broader landscape and you put a plant in the foreground and you try to, work that composition the best you can. And here the plant cluster sort of mirrors the mountain. This is a interesting plant. It grows to about 3 feet. It has widely spaced ray flowers, 12 to 20 of them. And because of the wide spacing, the flowers sometimes look a little bit spent, almost like and droopy. And this is a meadow that is downhill from the Sourdough Ridge Trail with the Cascade Asters, the scarlet paintbrush, and bunchgrass. Interesting, this was a particularly good year for this meadow. This was about 5 years ago. It hasn't really been quite this lush since. On the other side of the key, where we have no aster, no lupin, we have a couple community types, the bunchgrass cinquefoil or the passflower and magenta paintbrush. Now, I tend to sort of recharacterize this as paintbrush passflower because I'm sure that the meadow that Henderson was looking at are the meadows right above sunrise. And there's really not, in my view, a lot of paintbrush, in those meadows. They tend to look like mainly grass and passflower. Of course, the passflower looks like this on the sunrise side in large clusters, and they pollinate early and they usually go into seed. So it doesn't stay in bloom that often, but it will stay in seed for a long period of time. And this is what the bunchgrass passflower meadow looks like above sunrise. So this is a sunrise dry grass meadow, which is considerably different than the paradise lush or herbaceous meadow. This land is heavily tilled by pocket gophers, but I never see any of them. I don't know whether they do that at night or when. And this would be an example sort of on the edge of the bunchgrass cinquefoil community type that does have the magenta paintbrush. We've made it to the Alpine Zone, and I was hoping we could do that before 22, and lo and behold, we've made it. Could easily do an entire presentation on the Alpine Zone, which I've tried to do in the past. And we've arrived, baby and all. So we're in good shape here. The best way to get to the Alpine Zone is to take the Sourdough Ridge Trail west out of Sunrise. And here it is. This is one of my favorite pictures to look at in the winter. I've been on this trail a lot of times, and I can almost see the tip of my boot come into view at the bottom of that picture. Also, it's kind of interesting from a photographic standpoint. A lot of vertical lines, diagonal lines. It's got an S-curve, in the trail, and pretty good depth of field in that we're pretty good focus here, pretty good focus up here. And we also have a vanishing point, which is Echo Rock here off in the distance. Once we get to Frozen Lake, we have three choices. We can go up Burrows Mountain, out to Berkeley Park, and to Mount Fremont. We're going to take a quick look at all three of those. First is Burrows, named after John Burrows. It's actually named, Burrows Mountain was actually named by the mountaineers, and it was called John Burrows Mountain for a long period of time. And Burrows was an essayist, a naturalist, and these were popular writings back in the 1800s. And he was a friend of Walt Whitman. In last year's Douglasia, the spring edition, Frank Knight wrote an interesting piece on John Burrows, father of American wildflower guides. Pretty interesting. And one of the things that Burrows said is that one of these days, someone will give us a handbook of our wildflowers, by the aid of which we shall be able to name those we gather in our walks without the trouble of analyzing them. So I think it's kind of interesting. But if you're interested in place names and how place names become official, and this is the actual decision card that the U.S. Geographic Board used to officially designate Burrows Mountain. It was submitted by the National Park Service, and then it's approved, and then that becomes the official, the official name. This has been replaced by the USGS. So we are greeted by this sign as we head up First Burrows Mountain. It's about elevation 6,800 feet. I love this sign, and it was carved in sort of a raised relief. However, they did that, and most of these letters now have since sort of eroded away. So the sign's in pretty tough shape. On the other side of the mountain is a newer version where they just router these letters, into the wood. So this is kind of a national park classic. I hope they keep it in the museum. But this sign tells us that we are entering a very fragile area, which is similar to tundra. It almost cries out, to tell us that these flora face, many challenges in this kind of an environment. The one I like here is kind of recurring thaw-freeze cycles causing ice needles. And you can imagine these ice needles cut away at young sprouts and roots. It makes it hazardous. And also we have strong winds, high light, and interesting, very low precipitation. It's fairly dry. We're above the clouds in a lot of cases. We're on the north side of the mountain, so we have the rain shadow of Mt.Rainier, the rain and snow shadow of Mt.Rainier. And it can be very, very dry. Up on top, I was looking for a slide where I could use it as a background slide to put some information on habitat. And so I was going through things. This would be the kind of thing you could easily overlook. And this is the Burrows Mountain Trail coming up from the south side, or the Burrows Loop Trail. And I thought, God, just stop and look at this for a minute. I mean, when we're out in this kind of condition, we often complain that we can't see the mountain's out, or it's cloudy, or it's foggy, or whatever. But this is almost an ethereal scene. So it's almost like we need to stop and just look. So I call these extreme habitats. Probably not the best term, but what we have in the Alpine Zone are pumice flats, all kinds of rocky surfaces, and also anything that creates any kind of a foothold, rocky crevices, ledges. I like these trail retaining walls, provide habitat. That Almira is kind of one of my favorite plants, and it's always there. So the plants have to anchor themselves in the strong wind and conditions, and so you see plants that are low growing or grow in mats or cushions. And the Alpine Buckwheat is one of the most common, and has this enormous taproot, which is often exposed on the surface. But it also can also be a beautiful flower. It requires that we get down low and look, get low and then get lower. So to really get this kind of photograph, you literally have to be laying on the ground, and your camera may actually be, on the ground. People come by and sometimes ask me if I'm all right. One of my favorites, Pussy Paws. My attempt at this is Calyptrium umbellatum. And it has these wonderful, fragile looking pom-pom flowers on single stems that come out from a rosette of these fleshy leaves. So it's these stems are prostrate, so they're right laying on the ground. So it's adapted for these really, really tough conditions. But what a great looking flower. Now, interesting, on this plant, if you're careful and kind of brush away a little bit of dirt in front and then, carefully lift it up, you expose this enormous taproot. A real surprise to me of the Alpine Zone. The prototypical cushion plant in the Alpine Zone is the Moss campion. Forms these really dense cushions that are up to 16 inches across, probably larger in Rainier. The flowers are tiny, maybe a 1/4 inch, 3/8 at the most. I got a nice compliment from Andy McKenna. They did use this picture in the Alpine Flowers book. And he told me that the editor, who had looked at more than 7,000 pictures for the book, that this was her favorite, kind of this derby hat kind of look. Now, I got a feeling Andy could have told all the photographers as a way of thanking them that that was their favorite picture. The flowers are tiny. I knew I couldn't handhold the camera for this. I didn't want to set up a tripod or anything. So I took my hiking stick, my trekking pole, and I leaned it kind of on a rock and then put it toward the ground and created kind of this angular thing and just rested the camera on the pole to try to get this. So that's probably the best I could do in that situation, but these are small. This is how you're most likely to see it in the park. Look at this mossy cushion area. Now we should, a little surprising you see so many members of the Astraceae in the Alpine Zone, but David Beek says in his book that this is the largest plant family in the park. No surprise there, because this is the first or second largest family of plants in the world, depending on who's counting the orchids. Some of the worst weeds in the park are members of the family, as well as the classic meadow alpine wildflowers. But also, I'm estimating that there are 29 species, in the Alpine Zone as well, above 6,000 feet. So these plants, these include, of course, sunflowers, asters, daisies, arnicas, senecio, grossus, and they come in three variations, of course. Those that are have disc florets and ray florets, disc florets only, and then the linguate florets. And of course, we could look at a lot of these, and probably one of the showiest flowers in the entire park is the Alpine Aster. So we don't lose sort of glamour, by being in the Alpine Zone versus the subalpine. There's plenty to look at. The plants tend to be not in large communities. They tend to be sort of out on their own, surviving in these rough habitats. What we're going to look at, though, is just those that have the disc florets, which I think are interesting plants. The first one being here alongside the Burrows Loop Trail, Mt.Rainier, and this is Silverback Louina. Grows right out of the rocks and has a very interesting formation. When you look at these up close, and you see the recurved lobes of the stigma, it creates kind of this little spacey. I think this reminds me of something that's sort of outer space. And the silverback on the underside of the leaves is hypoluca is my best shot at this. Is whitish or purple underneath as of a leaf. That definition, that comes from a site that I've used a lot, which is calflora.net. Has an extremely good dictionary of botanical terms. And I've always wanted, on my website, I always wanted to explain, what the meaning of the genus and species names are. And so this has been a great, source. It is California. Of course, that includes Northern California. So it's not going to have our endemics. For example, you won't see a Canocii or a Rhaenyra or a Stricklandii. That won't be included in that dictionary. But when you look at plants named after botanists, and they do a great job on this site. So if you have a Kuseki, you're looking at Kusek, it'll be a rather full biography of each one of these botanists. So you'll see Piperi, Suxdorfia, Hull, Hitchcock, and Kuchenberg are also included in there. So it's got good coverage for us. I thought what would be an interesting project if someone would take that dictionary and then apply it to the new flora of the Northwest, and then fill in the missing terms would be a really helpful thing to have. Back down on the Sourdough Ridge Trail, sort of before we really get to Frozen Lake, is another composite that has diskette flowers only, and that's tongue-leaf Rhaenyra. Not endemic to the park, but its range is limited. It's mainly on the north side of the park and east. But where you'll see a lot of this is on the Pacific Crest Trail heading north of Chinook Pass, not south, Natchez Peak Loop, but north heading towards Sheep Lake. And it also has the recurved lobes of the stigma. Now back up on First Burrows Mountain, we look down to the north into an area called Berkeley Park, and it is flanked by Skyscraper Mountain over here on the west, and also Mount Fremont on the east. There's a Fremont lookout right there. We see a little bit of Grand Park off into the distance. If you read my Grand Park hike description, I'll mention this little rock outcropping right here. So just extend your hike a little bit to there. You have one of the most amazing views of the mountain. So we're going to head out to Berkeley Park from Frozen Lake. As soon as we leave that junction area, we'll run into this plant on the right side of the trail, which has become one of my favorites. It's Artemisia furcata. Might as well just use the scientific name on this one. I've become really interested in these plants. It seems like the harder they are to photograph, the more interested I am in them. That's Mount Fremont, by the way, in the background, in the Mount Fremont Trail. This plant is a cousin of the big sagebrush Artemisia in central Washington. So I'm getting a poke with the stick.
No.
No, she said.
Are you talking loud enough?
Uh,
I hear you.
Harder they are to photograph, the more I like them. And yellow flowers are particularly challenging because usually they're so reflective, harder than white flowers. So it's a nice idea to try to change the background, and the sky makes a good background for yellow and orange flowers. Yellow and blue are complementary colors on the color wheel as well, so you get a nice color composition. A little further down the trail, we'll see the Alpine Lupin, which is the shorter version of the Subalpine Lupin. It grows in large, low clusters or in smaller groupings. It has this leaf structure. which is these silvery leaves help collect moisture from the fog and the clouds, and then kind of funnel it. Much different than the larger leaves of the subalpine. We'll get to a point where we'll have a junction where we stay on the Wonderland Trail, or then we'll take the junction down to Berkeley Park. It's interesting, you'll get to a point where you'll actually have the Alpine Lupin give way to Subalpine Lupin, and you can see the actual distinction. So on this side of the line are the Alpine Lupin, on the other side of the line are the Subalpine Lupin. So this is at about 6,400 feet. But we'll use that as a delineation of the subalpine and Alpine zone. So as we descend into Berkeley Park, we will see another Lupin Bistorp community type meadow. This is about 6,100 feet, and it's just before we descend further down into Berkeley Park. This is a north-facing slope. The meadows that we see at sunrise are primarily south-facing slopes. And so my guess is that this area gets a lot of accumulated snowfall. We get into Berkeley Park. This probably won't see it like this every year, but maybe every 2 or 3 years you'll see this kind of a display. And as a lush herbaceous meadow, we've got all of our candidates here. Our last stop will be Mount Fremont, just before we head up right to the west of Frozen Lakes, the flat area, and we'll see the last of the composites with the disc florets only. And this is Perry's Arnica, also called the nodding Arnica. So all 4 of these, plus the American Sawwort, are included in the Alpine Flowers and Mt.Rainier guide. Now, you may not feel like it's a great wildflower hike when you start out, but it really is. It's one of the really nice true alpine sites. Rupicola is the last of the Castanea we'll look at. Discovered, I always like that, discovered on Mount Rainier by C.V. Piper. Means he was probably the first to collect it or document it in some way. Tucked in the rocks along the way will be the Sedum, King's Crown, which is really only seen in this area, Mount Fremont, or apparently around Sunrise in other places, but I've only seen it here. Quite sure it won't be in other areas of the park. And out at the end are these rock outcroppings with shrubby cinquefoil. One thing about this hike is if we have a late spring where there are snow fields that are still out at Mount Fremont, and then we get really hot weather, mosquitoes are unbearable. I've had times where I've had to just turn around and leave. The best for last. This is a good reason to go on the Mount Fremont hike. You'll see this elegant Jacob's ladder tucked in the rocks. Unfortunately, the blooming time I think is pretty narrow. So there's a lot of years that I haven't been able to really see it in bloom. But when you do, it's worth the trip. It ranges from 7,000 to 10,000 feet. I say here, making it one of the highest showy flowers. Might as well just say it is the highest showy flower in the park. The overlapping leaflets here form the ladder. Lower elevations, we have the showy Jacob's ladder where there's more spacing between those leaflets. Now at this point, you're probably wondering, who is the CV Piper? Well, here's CV, Charles Vancouver Piper. I'll shorten this story from what I would like to and what I do in the Mopheads presentation. But he is really our first homegrown, I think, truly professional botanist. He went to the Washington Territorial University, was one of the founders or certainly early members of the Young Naturalist Society, which is actually the genesis of the herbarium. And when he was 21 years old in 1888, John Muir was coming to climb the mountain and visit Mt.Rainier. And CV and his buddy William Booth decided they'd tag along, which they did. And they were part of the party that summited the mountain with John Muir. John Muir shown there seated in the snow. There were 7 in this party. Arthur Churchill Warner is a photographer. He lugged his photographic equipment and glass plates up to the summit. And he wasn't really an outdoorsman. He was kind of a studio photographer. And it was led by Philemon Van Trump. So there's 5 here plus Warner. So where's the 7th person? Well, it's actually CV Piper. The 21-year-old lagged on his way up, and he showed up about an hour later. Muir was apparently quite nice to him. He had a tough time getting down as well. Well, the next year, CV went up to the mountain again with the climbing party, but he decided he wasn't going to have anything to do with climbing the mountain. So he stayed down lower and collected with Reverend Eel, Reverend Wright, and David is holding Piper's herbarium sheet from that collection. And here's his label, August 1889. And that pretty much concludes that. I made it by 1 o'clock, which thankful for. I guess we could open it up for Q&A at this point, would be great. Denise, are you with me?
I'm with you. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I don't
Thanks.
see any questions and answers, so folks, please go ahead and post your questions. Here we have one from an anonymous attendee. Are glacier lilies best seen on the north or south side of the park?
They could possibly be seen on all sides of the park. Glacier lilies, like if I was actually going to look for glacier lilies on the north side of the park, I would probably go down into the Palisades Lake area, which you would access through Sunrise Point. Avalanche lilies are more widespread. Glacier lilies, I don't think there's a real. Glacier lilies can be seen, the yellow glacier lilies can be seen along the Sourdough Ridge Trail that I showed, coming up north out of Sunrise. And I'm sure they would be equally prevalent in the south side.
Sherry and Jim, it appears you've raised your hand and you'd like to ask your question unmuted. Go ahead. Sherry and Jim, you can unmute yourself. We'll come back to you.
I didn't have a question. I was just chatting. This has been wonderful.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much.
Denise, we have a number of questions here.
We do. We do.
on bloom time, peak flower blooming time.
Yeah.
Karen has asked that. There are a couple others, Jasna. I wish I had a really good answer for that. I used to have kind of this cavalier, sort of answer that Lloyd's of London used to only insure the Bellevue Arts and Crafts Fair when they had it outside for the last week in July and the first week in August. So that might be about as good as there's a couple things to say about this. For one, there is a project going on currently called Meadow Watch, which is a partnership between the University of Washington Biology Department and the Park Service. And they have a number of sites that they're doing survey work on, and part of that work is trying to get at peak bloom times. There's two things that's not going to probably give us information that we can use right now, but in the future we'll show those trends and give us some better time frames. The Park Service is doing a lot better job the last few years on making comments on wildflower blooming, and they're really quite good. And you can go to the Mt.Rainier website and you can go to Plan My Visit, and you will find the comments on wildflowers, and they will update those on a regular basis. The other thing is to look at the trail conditions information, on the Park Service website. And if you're looking for if you're on a particular trail, go to the Washington Trails Association and look for trip reports from people who have provided trip reports for that trail. And a lot of times, they'll make comments on wildflower blooming. But the best thing now, I think, is what the Park Service is doing, and they're doing a much better and better job on that. It varies tremendously, of course. I mean, who knows what this year will be like? Presumably later than sooner. And don't forget the forests. I mean, there's great hiking and wildflower viewing in the forest. In fact, I have one forest hike on my site called Green Lake Early, I actually call it. So it's something you can do in the forest, and there's great plants in there.
Very good. So we have a question here from Molly Van Dam about invasive species. Have any invasive species made their way to Mt.Rainier National Park?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not an expert in anything, and I don't know a lot about that. Other than one of the groups that I mentioned, the Mt.Rainier National Park Associates every year has an invasive species removal project with the Park Service. And they'll take an area like the West Side Road, for example, and then they will spend a couple days just trying to remove. But around Longmire, and there's a lot of species. I'm not sure anything has, but it's something the park botanist is very aware of. And if you drive up 410 sometimes in the summer, from that part that's in the park up by Cayuse Pass, you will see that they'll be out alongside the road doing invasive species mitigation work. And I imagine some things are coming from, eastern Washington over those roads, and they want to try to, deal with them right at the roadside.
Mark Egger, our presenter from yesterday, where would you recommend as a reasonably easy access location to photograph Aranthe caesposa on the mountain?
Aranthe caesposa. He's got to translate that for me into a common name. I have to think too long. To come up with what.
Okay. Well, and he says that thanks for a great presentation. So Mark,
Tell me, Mark.
Something more common for him, please, in the chat. Let's talk to somebody else. Let's see, we have Katie Lutz. Have you noticed any changes in wildflower community since you started hiking and photographing flowers around Mt.Rainier?
Not Well, there's been changes, there's been changes in habitat. I mean, the entire park is just one great big geohazard zone. And so there are some trails that I used to hike on that I can't anymore. And there's been two significant road closures, the West Side Road with glacial activity come from the south to Homa Glacier. And then unfortunately, the Carbon River Road is closed pretty right at the entrance. So you have to pretty much bike both of those to get to the trailheads you used to be able to drive to. And so in those areas, that habitat has changed. One of the things that is kind of interesting to me, there's some things that they're concerned about. One is that encroachment into the subalpine meadows by alpine fir. And so there's some concerns the Park Service is addressing there. It seems to me when I look at the Henderson thesis and his description, I'd have to spend more time with this, his description of the meadows above sunrise, that those meadows, which I showed as being bunchgrass, flower mainly, he really indicates that there would be more like magenta paintbrush in there, for example. Well, flower is pollinated by hoverflies, which is a very robust pollinator. So whether or not their proliferation is greater because of the pollinator is more capable would be kind of an interesting question. But other than that, I mean, I just don't have the basis to make any other calls on that.
So Mark Egger has corrected my terrible Latin here for you, but he's referring to the Mimulus cespitosus, or the large mountain monkey flower.
The only monkey flower that I am aware of are really three, and it's the Lewis monkey flower, the pink one that I mentioned, and then there's the mountain monkey flower, and which is a Talinga, and then there's a lower yellow mountain monkey flower, and then there's a chickweed. There's a chickweed monkey flower in the forest, which you can see along the east side trail. That's a possibility. The one interesting monkey flower little community that I have seen has been in the Paradise side, in the Upper Edith Creek drainage. There's a stream crossing that has a bridge stream crossing of the trail, which is just to the west of where the trail junction is with the Upper Paradise Glacier Trail. And I think that has yellow willow herb in it, but there's some interesting, the species he's looking for could be maybe in that area.
Very good. You have, as you can see here in the chat, several comments and praise for a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure.
And Betty Swift asks, are you seeing a disconnect between pollinators and bloom types?
Well, I think that's something that requires, a lot of data collection and analysis by professional people, and, really kind of anecdotal evidence that I might have or any feeling I have on it wouldn't really be, very meaningful. I'm really interested however, in photographing pollinators. And I think that any complete photographic study of a plant needs to show all of its life cycle, the whole phenology of the plant, and also try to show the pollinator as well.
Very good. Very good. I think you've addressed bloom time in several questions already. However, folks are looking for actual target dates.
I know it.
Yeah. So best time for wildflowers at Paradise and Sunrise, and what date is the best?
You know what I tried to do one time a long time ago, I thought, well, I'm going to really take this head on. And I started building this spreadsheet, where I was going to have, all the bloom, I was going to have the species in there in the area and the bloom times and, all of that kind of stuff. And this is obviously probably the most asked question. When
of course.
best time to see the wildflowers? And David actually addresses this. We have 13 little ecological notes, in our guide, and one of them is peak wildflower times. And one of the things he says in here is the peak of this display varies from year to year because it's dependent almost entirely on the timing of snowmelt. The later the snowpack melts, the later the peak wildflower time. Researchers on Mount Rainier have proven this relationship by comparing data for snowpack depth with the flowering period of more than a dozen wildflower species growing at locations on the north and south side of the mountains. That's the Meadow Watch program. But I would say it's not only the snowpack. And this year it looks like the South Cascades are at about 120% of normal. So we saw from those pictures of the visitor center that there's a lot of snow up there. But it's not only the snowpack, but it's the length of the winter, or the nature, the nature of the spring. Do we have a late spring, a wet spring? How does this all get kind of dragged out? So you might see a year where we have a little less than average snowpack, but you might see, kind of poor conditions or late conditions. So if you want to be in the subalpine zone, you need to probably think in terms of maybe at least July. And some places like Summerland, where you're really going up the Panhandle Gap, which is quite high. The Summerland hike almost in every year would probably be best in second half of April or August. So the alpine flora and the alpine zone there is probably going to be as good in late August as it would be in other places in late July. So it's highly dependent on where you are around the mountain, snowpack, spring conditions. Tough, but I would consult the Park Service website, and they will kind of announce that we're seeing so and so at such and such location. So it's gotten really good. We didn't have that. We didn't used to have that.
So I want you all to know I will forward this chat to Donovan so he can see all your comments of praise. Thank you all very much for participating today.
Hey, Denise?
Yeah.
I have one other quick item.
Okay.
And it's kind of a shameless, here's my.
Go for it.
Kind of a shameless plug here, but one of the photography, the presentation that I've been working on that I was supposed to give earlier this month in Bellevue, one of the outgrowth of that was the production of this poster. It's an 18 by 24 poster. And this will be available at the Burke Museum at some point in the future, whenever we get kind of back to normal. We haven't really thought much about it. It comes with a nifty little index and some comments. If you're interested in this, or if you're having trouble getting the guide, or if you have any questions about any of that, just shoot me an email, and I will make sure that I get back to you on the availability of these things. One last thing, as long as I have you all held captive, at some point, I'm going to discontinue my work on my website, Flowers of Rainier. And if there's any budding people out there that budding computer people that would like to take over a website, redesign it, and make it their own, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Very good. Well, thank you all. I hope you have a visit to Mt.Rainier in the near future, because our lands open up for all of us to love and enjoy again. Our next webinar is tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Don Schachtel discussing the WNPS plant list resource. I hope you all can consider joining and learning more about using that fabulous resource created by WNPS botanists over many years of listing plants found on the trails and spaces of Washington State. And we do have another webinar also on Monday with Gail Sklar on the common shrub or woody plants of the Puget Sound Trough ecosystem, as well as, and I'm doing this from memory, so bear with me, Wednesday, we have the Wenatchee Valley chapter hosting Helen Lau, U.S. Forest Service ecologist, speaking on the restoration of the I-90 corridor. And I've seen a shorter version of this presentation at the Botanical Symposium. It was excellent, so I highly recommend that. And on Thursday, Sarah Gage will be doing basic plant ID tips in an hour. So please join us for our final Native Plant Appreciation Month webinar on Thursday, April 30th. We do, however, have plans to continue this amazing resource into May, and the WNPS May e-news will feature programs that are already in the works for the month of May. Our first being May 7th with David Giblin presenting on the plants of the lower Columbia River. And that would be from I-5 West, including notable aquatic species. Lastly, I welcome you all to consider joining our Facebook group if you're Facebookers, because that is where our members are often posting photos they are seeing in bloom. So people ask about when are things blooming. Many of our members are out hiking and posting when and where they are seeing things all summer long, provided that we can get into our public lands this summer. So thank you all. Please stay safe, stay healthy. Donovan, thank you so much. This was spectacular, and I hope to see you again. And the common question, will you be sharing a recording of this presentation? The answer is yes. All of our Native Plant Appreciation Month presentations to date will be posted on the WNPS website in the coming days. Please stay tuned to future announcements. Thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous weekend.
Great job, Donovan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gail.
Every time I see your photographs, it's just so inspirational.
Spectacular.
Thanks.
Just beautiful.
Appreciate it. Hey, Denise.
Yeah, I'm right here.
Are we off the group?
No, where folks are leaving one by one. We still have 34 people on the call.
Oh, great.
And not too many raised their hands, so I opted not to do that because it takes time, and we're already at 1:23.
I've got 43 in the chat. So
Yes. So what I do is I send you a text document, and
Okay,
it says who the chat came from and what their comments were. And I
great.
can also send you the Q&A that comes in a CSV file, as well as the list of attendees.
Super. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's a great way for you to be able to follow up with folks. And we still have just a few still here. So I look forward to your next presentation in Bellevue, Donovan, and when that can be rescheduled. Of course, we don't know any of those things at this point in time, so it's hard to talk about them. But
What? And I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
yeah, I know Cheryl is looking forward to it very much. She shared that. So
Well, they kind of talked me into it, you know.
yeah.